Hello and welcome to my feedback to your Google Hangout 2. I wanted to thank you for a well-run session. You have a smallest group, but it was very lively and you had a thorough coverage of topics. Starting with the politicization of intelligence, I really liked, just like Helen said, I really liked how Melody talked about the fact that politicization cannot be avoided, but it can be managed and can be mitigated. And to some degree, we are responsible for doing just that at the individual level, agency level, and organizational level. And I really liked how you laid those out, starting with an individual integrity of the collectors and the analysts, and going all the way to the consumers, the policymakers that are requesting the intelligence, and how to bracket out their biases or political affiliations, or how to mitigate, and of course all the way through the collective organizational efforts. So I really liked your discussion here on that, and Helen, Melody, and John, you all chipped in and you had similar views on that. Ultimately discussing the fact that intelligence gathering is, and I think Helen put it up and very succinctly, that it is an arm of the government, that it suits the government agenda, that it is at the request of a policymaker who is she or he a politician. And so you brought it down to the discussion about very similar phenomenon happening at the local level, whether it is the chief of police that gets nominated by the city council and usually responds either to the board or city council or city manager most directly. They are, in political relationships, and they are fulfilling the agendas or priorities of politics at the local level. So, during the election time for a sheriff, on the other hand, a lot of things become priorities that are not priorities beyond the election time. So naturally, politics influences those activities as well. And with the sheriffs being elected, every 4 years, certain things come to the fore, and then, they sort of go subside when it's not the election season. So, of course, politics, like somebody once said, is sort of like, poly means many, and ticks are those things that get on the dog in the forest. You can't avoid it when you're in the forest. And so politics is, inherent part of the governance. And because the intelligence processes, especially when we are discussing national intelligence, are so inherent to the policymaker requests, you can't disentangle that. Loventhal, of course, provides some, discussion on that line. That is a dotted line where the analysts or the intelligence community advisor, they're not passed to give advice to the policymaker. They are just providing pure intelligence for the decision of policymaker. This is a model that was proposed by the father of intelligence studies, Sherman Kent, and that is the idealistic model, obviously, depending on the relationship between the Director of National Intelligence and the President and Presidential Cabinet, depending on how those relationships are. And Loventhal talks at depth about Woolsey and Clinton and different administrations, and where those relationships were tighter or didn't exist at all. That's going to depend on how much respect the policymaker will have for that intelligence community vizier, or the person that's at that produces that daily president's brief or national security estimates or whatever intelligence product that comes to them. So politics, yes, it's part of it, but we should expect our intelligence community to follow ethical path. And I think ethics is, I'm glad that Melody brought it out, because there is very little discussion in the readings, I think, about ethics per se, starting with, all those people that work in the intelligence cycle. And I did really like how, you brought it up, compared it to how it's not very different at the local level, because political pressures exist also on police chiefs and sheriffs at the local law enforcement. It was a very good discussion. And you talked about, and I think Helen had a discussion on looking at what's relevant versus being told what to look at, because it is relevant. Again, it represents that dilemma. Does the intelligence need to be local? I think that Melody had a little puzzled face on that question, as if, isn't law enforcement local? And I think that, if you're a federal law enforcement, you think it's the federal law enforcement that's the most standardized, that is big bureaucratic agencies that have standards and normative guidelines and bring a lot of resources to the play. So in intelligence side and terrorist side and homeland security side, it's a federal arm that is so relevant, because they have all the security clearances and they have access, and they are, they safeguard, they are the guard dogs for those processes. Typically, local law enforcement and intelligence, again, as we've discussed this semester, is not, or internal security related to intelligence, pure intelligence, is not the domain of local law enforcement, hasn't been a domain of local law enforcement. So when I ask, isn't the intelligence process inherently local, I'm asking about that paradox, because it is a paradox. It's truly, historically, federal agencies that have been charged with intelligence, not the local agencies. But the local agencies are inherently the ones that are on the ground, which you had a really good discussion on that. And Helen talked about, I think, if I'm not wrong, you talked about people that, no, maybe that wasn't your group. Never mind. I'll get back to that. But you agreed that law enforcement is local at the local level. And now Helen brought about the issue of gangs and how we can change approaches to prevent mission area rather than respond mission area. Because a respond mission area, when you think about the missions, under Homeland Security, is prevent or prepare, depending whether you're thinking about hazards or threats. And there is a respond, and there is a recover, and then there is mitigate. So if you look at the cycle of crisis management or emergency management, you've got prevent, respond, recover, and mitigate. When we think traditionally about local law enforcement, we're thinking respond, we're thinking react, we're thinking from the moment that the defecation hits the oscillating device. This is where the work of local law enforcement starts, when something goes boom, right? Traditionally. Now, prevent is a little bit different. And so now our focus is going to the domestic intelligence processes and how we're thinking about that. And Helen had talked about how criminal investigations of things that just happened, right? The MS-13 commits a crime, and then law enforcement goes into high gear and investigates the leads. By new policies possibly trying to change the statutes on this type of criminal organization and change it to terrorist organization, that gives you more teeth under the counterterrorism, which is of course preventative counterterrorism statutes, and now you have a little bit more leeway with investigations, before something happens. And I thought that was a very interesting discussion. And I also think that what's happening with that, Helen, and that's my thoughts on that, are that typical criminal justice realm is really expanding to transverse to homeland security topics so much that perhaps typical criminal justice processes need to be rethought and reinvented. And this is sort of a very good example of this thing bleeding over to, what's a criminal justice and what's homeland security? How is that different, and how the two fields may actually bleed from one to the next, particularly when you think about law and the criminal law. So very interesting. When you look back, again, the classic case of the first World Trade Center bombing was that we did not have criminal statutes that had to be that were dealing with terrorism. So what those people were on trial for was destruction of property by bombing, or there were totally different codes that were not criminal. So again, funding terrorism, funding transnational violent networks that related to drug activity is now transcending the criminal side and going over to the terrorism side. And when it does, that creates mechanisms, or at least legal mechanisms, for local law enforcement to be able to counter it better preventively before things happen. So a really interesting discussion on that. Melody, you were talking about fusion centers as platforms for, whether they are effective or not, and time has not shown. But one thing we know for certain, that they do serve as a platform for those different agencies to come and put the things on a table and visit with one another and share to a certain degree based on, who needs to know what. There is a dialogue that's going on between those different entities, and that itself creates opportunities for something, for that prevent mission area. I was really struck by what you said about that one thing, right? That one thing that might be able to be prevented. If it's just that one connection that was made, or this one dot that was connected to a larger picture, that is already the test to the fusion center having a potential to be very beneficial. Now, obviously, there is a long way to go for those fusion centers to be properly assessed, for efficiency and effectiveness, and proper benchmarks and proper guidelines to be established. Even though the ACLU article is a little dated, those concerns have not been worked out yet for most part. So that still remains a challenge. And I think, Melody, you addressed it very well when you said, okay, we already at that, the way I understand what you said is, we are already at that platform where we came together and we put those things on the table and we sort of, laid them out there. We are not there yet at the point where we have a good analytical process and standards for how to digest it, but at least it's there for reviewing. It's a first step, so to speak. I think, John, you chimed in on that and said that It's a lot of improvement if you have those joint terrorist task forces and those agencies getting together, because they were not doing those things, obviously based on 9/11 Commission reports and all those silo issues that they identified, and lack of information sharing and interoperability, mostly human interoperability, that was even a bigger problem than the technical one. So, but what's the outcome of sharing and how do you measure it? How do you, yes, sharing is good. So, we came and we are together and, we kumbaya. But how do you measure it? And what are the benchmarks for those fusion centers of what they produce? How can you capture that? Because this is what people will ultimately be interested in. They cost money. They are in a gray area of legal accountability. And sooner or later, you want to know, what are you getting for sacrificing certain accountability processes, the ambiguity in chain of command and things that the article mentioned. So you discussed that for law enforcement, John. I think you said that if you look at the law enforcement, for them it's good because they're invited to the table, local law enforcement, and they have access to things that they hadn't had access to before. But also, when you think about it, it's also an additional work. If you think that, Houston Police Department gets 41,000 suspicious activity reports a year and they attended to every single one, that is a tremendous dedication of resources to those fusion centers. How do you measure what they get in return? Because it's the return that's very heavily debated. And, it doesn't get debated too much because obviously local law enforcement wants to have something. But at some point, the accountability issue is an important one, and particularly because, as you started this whole discussion, because of politicization of intelligence, and because it is ethical to have accountability in intelligence spending and using of the resources. I think Helen had a really, really good conversation on local law enforcement being able to capture some a priori, before it happens, in that prevent mission area, capture things that happen in the communities, and on a night patrol, knowing the history of a particular building, what family lived there, and suddenly you've got things that are being brought in there in the middle of the night, or somebody's buying huge amounts of bleach or sulfuric acid, and if they don't have a water world in their backyard, I really like that. That something might stink, no pun intended. So there was a really good visual. I think for me it was a great visual of how in the prevent mission area the law enforcement is uniquely positioned. Now the question begs the answer: do generally local police officers from small agencies know what a sulfuric acid is and what it serves and what it does? And do they have that basic awareness what to look for? And I think that is a very valid argument made in the article about, what are they looking for? When you see something, say something, what am I really needing to see? And I think those indicators as well are not clearly specified, and that's the issue with it. If you see something, say something, or start reporting, which most of you found very beneficial, and I agree it is, but it could be more effective, possibly. Helen just brought it out that it all depends. Small police departments do not have money. definitely New York Police Department or LAPD are behemoths that have their own divisions for counterterrorism and intelligence services, and then they travel all over the world and they get training, and they are extremely proactive in those. And when you have 40,000 officers and the largest police department in the country, obviously it's totally different than in Texas, where you have 85% of police departments being less than 15 officers. So it's mostly rural, it's mostly small, and the resources are pretty much not there for that type of training or that type of awareness. So that's that's a disconnect, and you discussed that disconnect, and I think it's a valid issue, because when we think about terrorism, we say it happens in XYZ any town, United States. And so even though the probability is very low, the consequences are catastrophic. So that's one of those threats that most of the small jurisdictions think about it, but they really can't afford to think about it because of the low probability and other priorities in their police departments that are already probably most of the time under-resourced and underfunded. I think you had when we talked about criminal intelligence versus domestic intelligence gathering by police, and following on that issue, what are they supposed to pay attention to? John, you had interesting observations on the difference between a criminal and a terrorist. There's some good research out there on that, on the fact that the criminals are generally people that are opportunist versus terrorist target, even though lone wolves and recent recruitment efforts tend to shift that model of opportunism. It's not necessarily as targeted anymore for symbolic events, symbolic buildings, symbolic places. It is becoming more of the very asymmetric, but also opportunity target. So I think that that's shifting a little bit. The terrorist is usually the one that hunts. The criminal is usually the one that's hunted. And generally, the terrorist has a cause that is larger than self-interest. Criminals are purely self-interest driven. So those are very interesting observations. And how much of that distinction is recorded with local law enforcement? How much training do they get on that? Because you definitely think differently about countering criminal activity versus terrorist activity. So I thought that was a very interesting conversation that you brought up. When you talked about some of the issues with local law enforcement and intelligence gathering, of course, Melanie mentioned that obviously the NHEL and the Fourth Amendment and the probable cause and naturally the searches and things like that, they're different in criminal cases. They're different when you're dealing with issues that relate to terrorism specifically, and those intelligence gathering about possible plots. The last thing, and so you had a really good discussion here, and I think going back to fusion centers, you talked about how law enforcement sometimes shops for the right judge, and perhaps that's the issue with that intelligence process, that you try to sort of figure out the way how to overcome those challenges in domestic intelligence gathering. And then the last thing that you talked about was the private sector and clearances and the need to know and the information sharing from the perspective of a public and private relationship and fusion centers. And I really like Helen concerns about the refinery and being a part of national critical infrastructure, and being a company that employs so many people. I think you mentioned 20,000 people would have to be vetted, in where you work at your company. And those people have access to the most dangerous chemicals in the world, as you put it, and that makes you lose your sleep at night. And however, you don't disseminate some of this stuff to generally public at large because you do not want to create anxiety. You want to manage the fear, but definitely your sector is very highly vulnerable. John was talking about the issue of classified information and access, and private parties having that access. And I think you were approaching it from the standpoint of, you've got so many employees, and it could be an issue because you can't really control their, confidentiality of this information. I want you to all, and those are all really valid concerns. So the private stakeholders and fusion centers, are going to be generally people at the top of the food chain, selected people that have proper clearances. But what I want you to think about, thinking about a private sector as well, is their investments in intellectual development and intellectual property and patents. And, we expect fusion centers we expect the government to work for us because we are paying for it. We are sponsoring the whole enterprise as citizens. Whereas the private sector has the right to make profit for their intellectual investments and their research and development. So, of course, they want to safeguard those. And government has not always been the most careful with those type of things. So, case in point, government cannot even secure its own information. Talking about the Office of General Management records that were hacked a couple years ago. And so if you are not able to protect your federal resources and your own records from cyber terrorism, now the private sector comes to the table to share with you, and what guarantees do they have that those security protocols are going to be effective? Not that necessarily they're going to be in place, but that they are effective. So this is a double-edged sword. It's, we typically think about if you're working in a public agency, you're thinking, oh, the private sector is coming and who knows what they're doing. They don't have security clearances. They employ, people that can do some real big stuff or big damage with what they get. But on the other hand, think about the case of the Apple and San Bernardino murderers and their cell phone. And I think that really highlights the challenge between the private and the public in a fusion center, because it's very idealistic in a fusion center to expect that there is going to be that information sharing, but obviously Apple did not agree to give the FBI access to the decryption of its phone, even though the cause was, this is the imminent threat, potentially an imminent threat to, to life of American citizens. We don't know what's on that phone, but, we'll be able to get more intelligence from it. And Apple said no. So obviously, Apple has a responsibility to its own subscribers and to its own consumers and customers, and they also want to keep the brand name and the image because this is what they make money on. So this is sort of, another perspective to look at it from the aspect of intelligence and information sharing, and specifically, when we talked about fusion centers. I think I pretty much touched on most of the things you discussed. I'm not sure if you addressed the Homeland Security structures, laws, and legislative processes that support local intelligence gathering. I'm not sure you had any discussion on the Freedom Act or Patriot Act, or how it applies at the local level. That might have been something to touch on as well. But I really enjoyed your discussion. You were all very well prepared and engaged, and so I appreciate that. And that's all I have for you, and see you on the next one. And sorry for a delay on that one. Unfortunately, several things got up with me, but I'll try to get you caught up. Thanks a lot. Have a good weekend.